Good afternoon. Today I want to talk about an unpublished novel I wrote while I was in the Army, while I was stationed at Fort Eustis after being transferred out of the Pentagon in 1968. This will just build up to some other stuff I'll talk about later with my writing, but there's something that's interesting about it. It was it was called the Proles, Proles. In other words, is referring to the proletariat, like the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And there's the handwritten copy of it, reversed mirror effect on my computer and everything. But and just I've had it in a just a binder for years, since 1970, and I've kept it. Actually, there was a time when I was on a train, and I left it accidentally in Trenton, New Jersey. I had ridden back. I was living in 1970, or maybe it was 1971. I was living in an apartment in northern New Jersey, and I rode the commuter down and was going to transfer the train to DC in Philadelphia, and I accidentally left it in the train station, and I had to take a commuter train back to Trenton. They still had it in the station, in the commuter rail station, and I picked it up, and I don't think I have another copy of it. And then I took it home on the regular Amtrak, so I almost lost the copy one time back in 1970 or 71. That's Trenton Makes and the World Takes. That's that you can see from the Amtrak when you're riding south from the right side of the window crossing the Delaware River. But let me get back to the book. Actually, and I'll show you the table of contents, which is in a different directory. And it's a little hard to see from, I think it's this. Yeah, this is it. This the book was in two parts, and the first part, part one, I called The Covenant, and there's actually a couple of films called The Covenant, a horror film in 2006 about fraternity or kids with supernatural powers, but there's a film that's much more important in 2023 that I've got to see pretty soon about an American who promises to bring an African person who helped him get him a visa. It's a real interesting story. I'm going to see the film because I haven't seen it yet. But the covenant normally means a promise or an agreement. But it also, in the terms of the Bible, sometimes it means that it also was in the Old Testament, the Ark of the Covenant, but it also can mean the promise of Jesus that you will be saved if you have faith in him, in the resurrection and all of that. Not to preach a sermon or anything, but just the basis of Christianity, but just simply to say that in the story actually starts in I have to go back to the other frame here. The story actually starts on the campus of the University of Kansas back in the third semester that I was a full-time graduate student at the University of Kansas. It was in May of 1971. The story starts on the day I get out of an infirmary after a mild illness, and I'm looking at the Campanile Tower behind Strong Hall, and then I meet a friend, and then the contents of the story go back. Unfortunately, this doesn't persist. I have to go back and find it again. The contents of the chapters of the first part of the novel sort of sound like movements in a symphony or a sonata. And so the first chapter is me as a graduate student, at at KU and then the second, for the rest of the semester. And then the second semester chapter is the summer job back at David Taylor Model Basin, where I meet this guy that I call Hans Zugfeld, and I tend to identify with him and tend to think of him as a Christ-like figure. In other words, I idolize him. Gradually throughout the events of the novel, he catches on to it and then challenges me that if I follow him, he'll save me in the Armageddon. That's kind of the premise of it. So then development 1 in chapter 3 is the fall semester at KU, when I get my teaching job back, and I have a reputation for failing students in remedial, and basically it was a remedial algebra class. And this was when there was a draft, and if you were a young man and you flunked out of school, you could wind up getting drafted, and you'd wind up getting combat arms and be more likely to be a casualty in the Vietnam War. So in a sense, I had a kind of creepy kind of power in doing that as an assistant instructor back then in 1967. But I go on a trip and meet over the Thanksgiving weekend and meet another friend and so forth. Chapter 4 is the centerpiece, is where I go into I leave graduate school, take the master's orals, turn in the grades of the students, and then in 2 weeks become a soldier, drafted myself, and wind up in the special training company at Fort Jackson, which I've talked about before as part of my story. But it's a very graphic presentation of what my life in the Army was like, and in basic training, particularly with Special Training Company. And it winds up being a chapter in the third of my Do Ask, Do Tell books. I really should have see if I can. This is the third of the books. The Camtasia gets in the way of my keying in a URL, but it's this book. It's the third one. Do Ask, Do Tell. Speech is a fundamental right, being listened to is a privilege. The 2014 book here. And actually, I think in the 1968 presidential campaign, Hubert Humphrey was the Democratic Congress, said one time, free speech, free speech is it's guaranteed in the Constitution, but you don't necessarily have a right to be heard, which sounds like the title of my book. But Hubert Humphrey supposedly said that in 1968. And there's a restaurant in Georgetown that has a copy of that quote on the window, I noticed the other day. But getting back to the course of the book, development 2, where called the investigations, is where I'm in the Pentagon, and then I get transferred to Fort Eustis. So it's all very autobiographical. And there's another guy who's in the barracks who calls himself Rado Sewell, named after a scientist who actually wants to go into Vietnam and fight. And so chapter 6 is an incident where he goes to Vietnam, this other guy that was in the barracks, and now it's all being made up. It's all fiction. And he finds that there's a secret weapon which can decode somebody's consciousness and save it digitally and reconstruct the person later. That the Soviet Union has invented a weapon like this. Now, this is all fictitious, of course. This is 1968 and 1969, about the time of Stonewall, and that did not exist. But in those days, there were a lot of conspiracy theories that the Soviets had all kinds of bizarre things. We had the Northwoods plot during the Kennedy administration and so forth, the possible false flag. There was violence, and there were incidents around. There were some murders of service members in the United States that were never solved and so forth, including 2 in Georgetown and 2 Marines in Washington and Georgetown. And I remember there was lots of stuff going on. Of course, there was lots of stuff going on with the civil rights movement. In 1964, remember the 3 people in Mississippi. But anyway, and then chapter 7 is a recapitulation. And then also Prole, the title, the Proles, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, that's what it means. And it means that people in the upper middle class who depend on capitalism, so to speak, and don't depend just on their own labor, but are taking advantage, are oppressors, or, it's basically the premise of communism, are taking advantage of people who work with their hands for a living. People on the top who can't do things for themselves, the lazy fat bourgeoisie, which deserves to be, a revolution and deserves to have it taken away from them. Well, that's what happened then with the Bolsheviks, and I think it was 1917 when they stormed on, I think, the Tsar's palace and killed them, didn't they? And it was very violent, the Russian Revolution. So yeah, and the idea that people, especially like me, who were kind of marginal men and who kind of used their education to get out of, potentially get out of the draft with student deferments, but because of my background of being sort of, undermined by the expulsion of William and Mary for admitting blatant homosexuality, I wanted to actually repair my reputation by serving, but I didn't. So I sort of served without serving, because I didn't get sent to Vietnam. I got sheltered. I was in the Pentagon, and I was sent to Fort Eustis to a place, which was non-combat and had sort of a phony mathematician job. But what happens is that the character who's called Hans, who the character based on me idolizes, finally catches on to me and then challenges me to go on a treasure hunt and find some clues. Sort of like on the Howdy Doody show in the 1950s, find some clues, and eventually the last clue is this place where you go inside a tunnel and where the weapon is used on you, and your body is sort of dematerialized into and stored on a disc, and then it's recaptured and rebuilt 14 years later. So this is 1970 going to 1984. Well, that's 39 years ago. So this didn't happen, obviously. But what happens at the end of chapter 7? The character based on me and some of my friends are dematerialized and then brought back to life without our being aware of it. It's sort of like general anesthesia. You don't even realize it's happened to you. You just wake up. And we go outside and we're told that the world, the quotation is, the whole world has gone back to the bay. And back to the bay was when we were at Fort Eustis, was the threat that we could get put back on Cape, go back living in the bay and be put back on having KP duty and that kind of thing. So back to the bay was a big joke in the Army. I was called Chicken Man and everything at Fort Eustis. So the chapters in the second part, the Great Summons, well, that was what Mahler also called the last movement of his Second Symphony. But here I make them like movements in a requiem mass. And in the second part, there's been a nuclear war, and what remains in the United States is sort of decomposed into self-sufficient city-states. And I'm sort of given a girlfriend named Tovina who accompanies me, and we sort of get bounced around from one place to another. And some of the other people are sort of just resurrected when one person who was unpopular just appears, I call collect on delivery, in one scene. And the way I talk about some of the people that were not as appealing, is not real complimentary. I won't really repeat it here. Um, but then at the end, we're led back to the place, and at the end, those of us who showed the faith, and those who find out the covenant will be kept, will be sent to another planet to start over with civilization, start over, sort of like the end of Don't Look Back, I guess now. And the world is blown up at the end. So that's the end of the novel, The Proles. I actually tried to send it to a publisher. Excuse me. It's hard to talk. I actually tried to send it to a publisher shortly after going to work for Univac, that is, going to work for Univac, and living in an apartment in Caldwell, New Jersey. And let's just show you the page numbers here. It goes, you can't see it all on one page, but you can see that it's pretty long. The document's pretty long. Those are the page numbers of the chapters. But going back to I sent the manuscript to a publisher in New York, and then I don't think I had made a copy of it either. I don't recall that I had. It was more expensive to Xerox then, but it was sent back to me, with a no, but the actual book, the actual manuscript, was in a package at my apartment door. And the apartment was a garden apartment on SB Road in Caldwell when I got home one day in October of 1972. And this was before I would come out a second time. I sort of thought in those days that if I could have and I talk about this in the third book, I talk about it in chapter 3 of the third book, that if I could have my hero, so to speak, one kind of final satisfaction, which sort of happens at the end of the Proles, then I would be able to marry and have children and have a straight life. And that all went out the door in 1973 in February, when I had what I call my second coming, which is chapter 3 of the first book, which is chapter 3 of the first Do Ask, Do Tell book, which I haven't really given in detail yet on these talks. But anyway, that's kind of what I have today, and I just thought you would enjoy hearing about this unpublished novel. It's kind of kooky, and it actually could kind of work.